The bottle shattered across the back of her head, and in the half-second before I understood what I was seeing, I thought it was a light fixture coming down. I had been at the bar for 3 hours, which is longer than I usually stay in a place like the Anchor Wheel on a Friday night. But I had run into two men I served with a decade ago, and we had fallen into the kind of conversation that only happens when the years have put enough distance between the service and the present. We were at the far end of the bar, 3 stools from the wall, and she was 5 stools down from us, alone, with a glass of water in front of her, and a posture that said she was not there to be approached. I had noticed her when she came in. I notice most people who come through a door the way she came through that one, the specific quality of attention, the way her eyes moved across the room before her body committed to entering, the slight adjustment she made as she came in that put her back to the wall and the door on her left. My name is Sergeant First Class Arvid Connell, retired, and I spent 11 years doing door entries in places considerably more hazardous than the Anchor Wheel. I recognized the habit. The 3 men who had been at the pool table for most of the evening were louder than the rest of the room and getting louder. The biggest one, I will call him the big one because I do not know his name and did not ask for it afterward, had been making comments to the general air of the bar since about 2200 that were not directed at anyone specific and did not need to be, because the air of a bar absorbs that kind of noise the way water absorbs heat. The bartender, a woman named Priya who had been working the Anchor Wheel for 3 years by her own account, was managing it with the specific patience of someone who has managed this situation many times and knows that confronting it directly makes it worse. At 22:40, the big one moved away from the pool table and toward her stool. I watched him. He stood beside her stool and said something I could not hear, and she answered without turning. He said something else. She answered again, still without turning. Whatever she said, it did not satisfy him, because he said a third thing, louder this time, audible in the general noise, that was not a question and not an invitation but a statement about her, delivered in the specific register of a man who is performing for the 2 men still at the pool table. She looked at him then. She said something, level and direct, that was long enough to be a complete sentence. He laughed. He turned back to the pool table and said something to his companions that made them laugh. Then he picked up an empty bottle from the edge of the pool table, walked back to where she was sitting, and hit her across the back of the head with it before anyone in the room had registered that his hand was moving. The bottle shattered. She went forward against the bar, both hands catching the edge of the bar rail, which is how I know she did not fully lose consciousness. And then she was still for one complete second, head down, hands gripping the rail. The bar went quiet. Priya was already moving, already reaching for the phone. Then the woman at the stool raised her head. There was blood, not a large amount, but visible, a line of it running from below the back of her hairline down toward her collar. Her face, when I saw it, was the color of someone who has taken a serious strike and whose body is managing the consequence of it. Her eyes were clear, not glazed, not disoriented, clear and in focus, and locked on the man standing 3 feet from her. He said, with a flatness that was more disturbing than the original noise, "Go home." She stood up from the stool. I will try to describe what followed accurately, because the inaccurate versions I have heard since tend to compress it or dramatize it in ways that miss what was actually remarkable about it. She was not large. She was not physically imposing in any external way. She stood, and the big one was significantly larger than her in the way that some men are built significantly larger than the median, and the 2 men from the pool table were moving toward the bar by this point, and Priya was on the phone. What happened was methodical. That is the word I would use to a colleague. She handled the first contact from his left arm, a grab, not a swing, in a way that redirected it and took his balance in the same motion. And then she was no longer where he was reaching and he was off balance, and one of the pool table men had arrived, and she managed that one with a series of movements that I can describe technically, but that I will summarize as: she knew where the weight was, she knew where it was going, and she put each man where she needed him to be to deal with the next one. The third was the most straightforward because, by the time he arrived, the dynamic of the situation had already been established. None of it was violent in the sense of rage. None of it involved impact that was beyond what was necessary to stop the movement she was redirecting. All three men were on the floor. None of them were badly hurt. I am qualified to assess that, and I am telling you what I assessed. She had made certain choices throughout the sequence that kept the outcome within bounds that could be described as controlled. She stepped back, she checked her hands. She sat down on the stool. Priya, who had been on the phone with the police dispatcher, said into the phone, "3 men down, no, not that kind of down. They're on the floor, send someone." Then she hung up. She looked at the woman. She said, "You're bleeding." The woman said, "I know." Priya said, "I'm going to get the first aid kit." The woman said, "Thank you." I walked over and introduced myself and told her I had been watching. She looked at me with the same level of attention she had given everything else in the room since she walked in. I told her the 3 men were not getting up quickly and that the police were coming. She said she understood. I asked her if she was all right. She said she had a headache. I said, "That seems accurate." I looked at the back of her head and confirmed the cut was not deep enough to require what I would call urgent intervention. The headache is going to be significant for a few days. She said, "Yes." I said, "What did the first one say to you before he picked up the bottle?" She considered whether to answer. Then she said, "He told me I was in the wrong bar for someone like me. He said women like me come to places like this looking for something and then get upset when they find it." She said it without inflection. I told him I was not looking for anything and that he should go back to his game. She paused. He found that funny. I said it turned out not to be. She said nothing. She picked up her glass of water, which had somehow survived the sequence without being knocked over, and drank from it. The officers arrived 6 minutes later, 2 of them, a young man and a woman who introduced herself as Officer Delcourt. The 3 men were on their feet by then, the big one holding his right wrist and saying things about what he intended to do, and Officer Delcourt listened to him for about 30 seconds and then told him to sit down in a tone that resolved the question of whether he was going to. Delcourt interviewed the woman first. The interview was brief, the woman was clear and precise, and gave the sequence in the same flat, accurate way she had described the initial confrontation to me. Delcourt wrote it down. Then Delcourt looked at the back of her head and said, "You should have that looked at." The woman said, "I will." Delcourt said, "Can I see some ID?" She produced a wallet and handed it over. Delcourt opened it. I was standing close enough to see Delcourt's face when she read what was in the wallet, and what I saw was a specific kind of stillness that law enforcement people develop that is the controlled version of a more obvious reaction. She handed the wallet back. She looked at the woman for a moment. She said, "Yes, ma'am, we'll take it from here." She paused. "We'll note in the report that you exercised restraint." The woman said, "They were not badly hurt." Delcourt said, "No, but they could have been." She said it as a statement of professional recognition, not a warning. The woman nodded once. I found out what was in the wallet the way I find out most things in these situations, which is through the informal network of people who have served and who talk to each other. Officer Delcourt had a cousin who had been at a joint training exercise 18 months prior, and that cousin had served in a unit that had operated alongside a Navy SEAL element. And in that element, there had been a woman whose record, once you knew what you were looking at, was the kind of record that does not get published because the operations it describes are not published. The wallet contained a military ID. The rank on the ID was Chief Petty Officer. The unit designation on the ID was one that Delcourt, who had done a DoD contractual rotation at a joint command 3 years earlier, recognized without needing it explained. The woman at the anchor wheel on that Friday night, sitting on a bar stool with a headache and a glass of water and blood drying below her hairline, was a Navy SEAL. I have thought about the right way to end this account because the obvious endings are wrong. The obvious ending says, the attackers learned a lesson. That may be true, but it is not the point of what I saw. The obvious ending says, she was vindicated. That is also not quite the point, because a woman who has been through what her record describes does not require a bar in the Anchor District to vindicate her. The point of what I saw was this. A person absorbed a serious unprovoked assault, managed the consequences with a level of controlled technical skill that years of the hardest training in the American military had built into her, sat down on the stool, drank from a glass of water, and answered Officer Delcourt's questions clearly and without embellishment. She did not characterize the three men beyond what was necessary for the report. She did not express satisfaction at the outcome. She held her own headache and someone else's first aid kit with the same equanimity. That is not what most people do in that situation. Most people, having been struck with a bottle and having managed 3 attackers without injury to themselves, feel something about it: relief, anger, a surge of adrenaline that expresses itself in some way. If she felt any of those things, they were not visible. What was visible was the same thing that was visible when she walked in the door. Attention, economy, the specific composure of someone who has been in situations considerably more demanding than a bar on a Friday night and has decided, a long time ago, how she is going to conduct herself in them. I gave Officer Delcourt my statement and left. On the way out, I stopped where she was sitting and told her I hoped the headache was short. She said, "Thank you for staying." I said, "Of course." She said, "You were watching the door when I came in." She said it not as an accusation but as an observation. I said, "Old habit." She said, "Yes." She picked up her glass, "Same one." That was the end of the conversation. I went home. I did not see her again, and I do not know her name beyond what I overheard when Delcourt addressed her, and I did not ask. I know what I saw. I know the quality of the work when I see it. I spent 11 years in rooms harder than that bar, and I know what training at a certain level produces in a person's movements and choices and decisions under pressure. The sequence she ran through those 3 men was not improvised. It was built. It had been built over years of deliberate, methodical preparation, and it showed in every movement the same way that craftsmanship shows in the work of anyone who has taken their trade seriously for long enough. There was a moment, right after the 3rd man went down and she stepped back and looked at her hands, where I could see her accounting for the situation, checking the room, checking her own condition, confirming that what needed to be stopped had been stopped and nothing else needed doing. It was 2 seconds, maybe 3. It was exactly the right amount of time to spend on that accounting, and then she sat down. That is what I remember, not the bottle, not the sequence. The 2 seconds of accounting and then the stool and the glass of water. Priya told me later, when I stopped in the following Monday, that the 3 men had been charged with assault and that the case was straightforward. She also told me, because she had pieced it together the way bartenders piece things together, that the woman I had seen had been in the Anchor Wheel twice before, on quiet weeknights, and had always sat at the same end of the bar with a glass of water and left after an hour without talking to anyone. Regular, quiet, unremarkable. Priya said I should have put it together sooner, the way she always sat, the way she came in. I said that was all right. Most people do not know what they are looking at until they have been shown. I want to be careful about the next part because it involves information I did not witness directly, but which I can verify from the sources I trust, and which belongs in any honest account of what happened at the Anchor Wheel. The 2 men who had come from the pool table were named, in the police report, as Decker Mollies and Ryan Floor. The big one, the one who struck her with the bottle, was named Garrett Spence. All 3 had prior records of varying weight. Spence had a prior assault charge that had been plead down. Mollies had 2 disorderly conduct citations. Floor had a DUI from 4 years prior that was the cleanest record of the 3. None of this made them unusual for a bar fight on a Friday night. which is to say that what they did was wrong, and also that what they did was the kind of wrong that happens at bars on Friday nights throughout the country. And the reason it became something other than a routine bar incident was entirely what happened after Spence picked up the bottle and she stood up from the stool. The charges that were eventually filed against all three assault causing bodily harm, with Spence additionally charged with assault with a dangerous weapon for the bottle, moved through the court system in the way that clear cases with multiple witnesses tend to move. Priya's statement was the anchor. Mine was corroborating. The arresting officer's observations were corroborating. The surveillance footage from the bar's corner camera, which covered the pool table area and the bar rail, was the clearest corroboration of all, and I understand from Delcourt, whom I spoke with once by phone, that the footage removed whatever ambiguity might otherwise have existed about the sequence and the initiation. She was not required to testify. The case resolved before it reached that point. I mention this not because the legal outcome changes what I saw, but because I want to be precise about what restraint means in this context, which Delcourt used and which I also want to use accurately. 3 men attacked her, 1 with a weapon, 2 with their hands. All 3 were on the floor in under 2 minutes. None of them required emergency medical treatment. The big one had a strained wrist from the initial redirection. One of the others had a shoulder that was sore for several days, based on what Priya heard from the waitress who knew someone who knew Molly's. The third had his pride. That is the entirety of the physical consequences for 3 men who attacked a person with a bottle without warning. The restraint Delcourt noted in her report was not a legal conclusion. It was a professional observation about the gap between what she was capable of doing and what she chose to do. That gap is significant, and it is significant because it was a choice made under physical duress, with a head injury, in real time, against 3 men who were not operating with any equivalent constraint. She had the training to close that gap in any number of directions. She chose the direction that produced the result she chose to produce. That is not automatic, that is discipline. I have discussed this with men who have the same background I have, who understand the specifics of what that kind of training builds. The consensus is consistent. The hardest thing the training teaches is not the technique. The technique is learnable by anyone with the physical capacity and enough time. The hardest thing is the decision-making under stress, the ability to choose in real time the response that is proportionate to the threat rather than the response that the adrenaline and the anger want to produce. That decision-making is built through scenarios and repetition, and the kind of deliberate debrief practice that identifies every moment where the decision went wrong and corrects it, over and over, until the corrected version is what comes out under pressure instead of the uncorrected version. She had been through that process enough times that the corrected version came out cleanly in a bar with a head wound against 3 men. I watched it happen. The corrected version looked like this. Stop the threat, contain the outcome, sit down, drink water, give the officer a clear statement. That is the end of the tactical account. The personal account, the part that has stayed with me longer, and that I think about when I am being honest with myself about what I learned from being in that bar at that hour, is simpler and more difficult. I've been in rooms where people with her training and her record were treated the way that woman was treated from the moment she walked in the door of the anchor wheel. I have been in those rooms as a participant, not always on the right side of the assessment. I have looked at someone because of how they were dressed, or how they were built, or what the context seemed to say about them and made a calculation about what they were capable of, and the calculation has been wrong. Not always dramatically wrong, but wrong. The man who struck her with the bottle made a calculation too. He calculated that the woman in front of him was someone who could be struck with a bottle and would respond in the ways that he expected. He was wrong on both points. She was not who he calculated she was, and she did not respond the way he calculated. Both failures of calculation came from the same source. He was looking at the surface and not the substance, and the surface was designed by a long career of operational work to give nothing away. She was not dressed to be noticed. She sat in a way that took no space. She kept her back to the wall and her eyes on the room, and she ordered a glass of water, and she did not talk to anyone. Everything about her surface said, unremarkable person, alone, quiet. The substance behind that surface was 11 years of service in one of the most demanding military specialties in the American Armed Forces, 3 combat deployments, and the kind of record that is described in files that most people do not have clearance to read. The gap between the surface and the substance is not an accident. It is one of the things that training at that level produces in a person. The capacity to be invisible when being invisible is the correct posture, and to become something entirely different when the situation requires it. She had walked into the anchor wheel on a Friday night and been invisible correctly for more than 2 hours. Then the situation required something different. She produced it. Then she became invisible again, sitting on a bar stool drinking water. I left the bar at 23:40. Priya called me a cab because my truck was around the corner, and I had had enough to make the truck inadvisable. While I waited for the cab outside, I thought about what I had just watched, and about what it meant for the accounting I carry from 11 years of making my own calculations about what other people were capable of. My accounting needed an adjustment that night. I made it. I am still making it, honestly, in the years since. The cab came. I went home. Some things you sit with for a long time before they finish settling into the right place in your understanding of how the world works. That one settled into the right place. It took a while, it got there.